Millionaire encounters his ex-wife and a baby at the hospital. The truth comes out, but before telling this story, subscribe to the channel to follow the daily stories. The sun shone intensely over Chicago that Wednesday morning. Ethan Thompson adjusted his navy blue tie as he gazed at the city through the panoramic window of his 20th floor office. The chaotic traffic on Michigan Avenue seemed tiny from that height, like a distant anthill moving at its relentless, frantic pace. "Mr. Thompson, the documents for today's meeting are ready," announced Emily, his trusted secretary of over 10 years, placing a brown leather folder on the mahogany desk. "Thank you, Emily. This is the day we've been waiting for." Ethan took a deep breath. At 42, he was about to sign the most important contract of his life. Thompson Construction, the company he had practically built from scratch, would be responsible for the expansion of the Chicago Medical Center, the most prestigious medical facility in Chicago. A $120 million project that would cement his name among the great entrepreneurs of the United States. "Your coffee is here as well, sir. And don't forget that the meeting with the hospital board has been moved up to 10 a.m. Ethan checked his watch. Only 2 hours remained. After dismissing Emily, he glanced over the contract numbers once more. Every detail had to be perfect. In his journey, from starting as a freshly graduated engineer to becoming the owner of the third largest construction company in the country, he had never left anything to chance. "Peter, get the car ready. I'll be down in 15 minutes. He informed his driver through the intercom. In the elevator, Ethan checked the latest messages on his phone. A bank notification informed him that his stocks had risen another 3%. He smiled faintly. Everything was going according to plan, just the way he liked it. The trip to the Chicago Medical Center took less time than expected. The driver knew the shortcuts to avoid the city's notorious traffic. As he stepped out of the car, Ethan was greeted by Daniel Harris, the hospital's operations director. "Ethan, so glad you're early. Can we do a quick inspection before the meeting?" "Of course, Daniel. I'm looking forward to seeing the site where we'll carry out the biggest project in the history of Chicago Medical Center." The two men entered the hospital complex. The main building, with its 40 years of existence, was imposing, but Ethan could already envision the new towers that would be built, modern and technological, tripling the capacity for patient care. As they discussed technical details, they walked through hallways, visited various areas, and reviewed architectural plans. "The new oncology wing will be here," Daniel pointed to an adjacent plot of land, "and we need to ensure that the construction doesn't interfere with the hospital's normal operations." "Don't worry, we've developed a construction system that minimizes noise and dust. The patients will barely notice we're working here." The technical visit was going as expected, until as they crossed the hallway of the pediatric wing, Ethan felt as if time had frozen. Among doctors in white coats and hurried nurses, a familiar figure appeared. Shoulder-length brown hair, the elegant walk he would recognize anywhere. Rachel, his ex-wife. She wasn't alone. In her arms, wrapped in a light blue blanket, was a baby. Ethan felt his heart race. The last time he had seen Rachel was almost 3 years ago in court, when they signed the divorce papers. "Ethan, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," Daniel asked, noticing the sudden paleness of the businessman. "I need a moment," he murmured, unable to look away from the scene in front of him. Before Daniel could respond, Ethan had already walked away, automatically heading toward Rachel. A nurse was talking to her, gently stroking the baby's head, who seemed to be sleeping peacefully. "Rachel." Hearing her name, she turned around. The shock on her face was as evident as Ethan's. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I came for a meeting. My company is going to oversee the expansion of the hospital," he explained, but his eyes couldn't pull away from the child in her arms. "And you? This baby?" Rachel adjusted the little one in her arms, immediately sensing what was going through her ex-husband's mind. "It's not what you're thinking. This is Michael. He was left at the hospital's doorstep 3 weeks ago. I'm volunteering with the temporary foster care program. The information should have brought relief, But for some reason, Ethan felt a strange unease. During the 5 years they were married, Rachel's dream had always been to have children. They tried countless times, but the pregnancies never came to term, leaving deep emotional scars on both of them. "You're working here. I thought you were still at the law firm." "I left there a year ago. I decided to follow my heart, and now I oversee the hospital's legal department and the adoption and foster care program," she explained, her voice blending professionalism with an evident discomfort about the situation. The baby stirred in her arms, briefly, opening his eyes large and dark before falling back asleep. "He seems calm," Ethan remarked, not quite sure what to say. "He's a fighter. He was abandoned when he was just 3 days old, but he's healthy and strong." Daniel approached, breaking the tense moment. "Ah, I see you've already met Dr. Rachel. She's been doing exceptional work here at the Chicago Medical Center." "Actually, we already knew each other," Rachel replied diplomatically. "We were married." The surprise on Daniel's face was evident. "Oh, I didn't know. Well, that certainly makes our partnership even more interesting." An awkward silence hung between the three of them until Rachel's phone rang. "I need to take Michael for his checkup." "It was interesting seeing you again, Ethan. Good luck with the project." As Rachel walked away down the hallway, Ethan remained still, feeling strangely unsettled. The unexpected encounter with his ex-wife had unearthed emotions he thought were long buried. But there was something more, something about the image of Rachel holding that baby that stirred a feeling he couldn't quite name. "Shall we, Ethan? The board must already be waiting for us in the meeting room." Nodding mechanically, the businessman followed Daniel. But his mind was no longer focused on the $1 million contract he was about to sign. It was back in the corridors of that same hospital years ago, when he and Rachel had received the news of yet another interrupted pregnancy. And what came after? The discussions about adoption, his firm refusal, the painful separation. As he walked toward the meeting that was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than a mere reunion had happened in that hospital hallway. Something that perhaps could change everything he had ever believed about family, legacy, and the true meaning of building something for the future. The meeting with the board of the Chicago Medical Center had ended over 2 hours ago, but Ethan remained seated in his office, staring blankly at the signed contract on the table. The words seemed blurred, unable to hold his attention. In his mind, the scene of his encounter with Rachel and the baby in her arms kept replaying. "Any issues with the contract, Ethan?" asked Matthew Roberts, his business partner and longtime friend, entering the room after a light knock on the door. "No, everything's fine. It's just that—" He hesitated, unsure if he should share what he was feeling. "I ran into Rachel today, at the hospital." Matthew stopped halfway to the chair, surprised. "Rachel? Your ex-wife? What was she doing there?" "She works there now. She oversees the legal department and an adoption program." Ethan paused. "And she was holding a baby in her arms." Matthew finally sat down, studying his friend's troubled expression. "And that got to you," he concluded. "Not as a question, but as a statement. It shouldn't have. It's been almost 3 years. We've gone our separate ways. Some wounds take longer to heal, my friend." Ethan stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Down below, Chicago began to light up as the sun set over the polluted horizon of the metropolis. The city never slept, just like his memories. "You know what's the strangest thing, Matthew? Seeing her with that child, it didn't bring me anger or resentment. It was like—" he searched for the right words. "Like I was seeing something that should have happened." "You tried so hard to have kids," Matthew commented cautiously, well aware of the couple's history. "And I couldn't accept the idea of adoption. That's what ended our marriage." He turned to his friend. "I always wanted an heir with my blood, someone to carry on my legacy. It seemed so important back then." "And now?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. "Now I don't know anymore. Seeing Rachel with that baby, she seemed complete, as if she had found what she had always been searching for." That night, Ethan drove his own car for the first time in months, dismissing the chauffeur. He needed to feel in control, even if it was just over the steering wheel. Without realizing it, he took the route that led him to Lincoln Park, the neighborhood where he had lived with Rachel during their years of marriage. He stopped in front of their old building, watching the lights on in the windows that had once been their home. He remembered the day they bought the apartment, how Rachel was enchanted by the spacious balcony where they could host barbecues and entertain friends, how she immediately pointed to the smaller room saying it would be perfect for a baby that never came. Back at his apartment in Gold Coast, Ethan couldn't sleep. The memories flooded in like a torrent. The first time he met Rachel at a legal event, the marriage proposal by the Mississippi River during a trip to New Orleans, the joy when they discovered the first pregnancy, and the devastation that followed the complications. And finally, the argument that marked the beginning of the end. "Why can't we just give love to a child who needs parents, Ethan?" Rachel's voice echoed in his memory, filled with pain and confusion. "Because it's not ours, Rachel. That doesn't carry our blood, our history, our genes." "And is that really so important? More important than building a family, giving and receiving love?" He didn't answer that night, and his silence spoke louder than any words. The next morning, Ethan woke up with an unexpected determination. He needed to understand why that encounter had affected him so deeply. After a few calls, he discovered that Rachel was working full-time at the hospital and usually spent her mornings in the pediatric wing. When he arrived at Chicago Medical Center, he justified his presence by saying he needed to check some technical details for the expansion project. He walked through the halls, trying to appear casual, until he saw her coming out of a room. Rachel was chatting animatedly with a nurse, but there was no sign of the baby. "Rachel?" he called, approaching her. She turned, surprised. "Ethan. Twice in 2 days. I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I'm just checking some details about the project," he lied. Then, as if the question slipped out involuntarily, he added, "And the baby, Michael." Something in her expression shifted, a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "He's in the nursery." "Why?" "Just curiosity. You seemed very comfortable with him yesterday." Rachel studied him for a moment before answering. "Do you want to get to know him better? The nursery is at the end of this hallway." The offer caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to invite him closer to the child. Still, he nodded and followed her. The nursery at Chicago Medical Center was a calm and welcoming environment. Through a glass window, Ethan observed several children in their cribs. Rachel pointed to one of the babies sleeping peacefully. "That's Michael. He's almost a month old now." Ethan watched the tiny being, so vulnerable yet so strong, for having survived abandonment. "Who would leave a child like this?" he asked, more to himself than to Rachel. "It's not always for lack of love, Ethan. Sometimes it's precisely because of love that someone makes that decision, when they believe they can't provide what the child deserves." Something in those words struck a deep chord within Ethan. And what will happen to him? If no family member shows up, he will enter the adoption system. There are already a few interested families. She paused. "Actually, I'm also considering submitting an application." The revelation shouldn't have been surprising, considering Rachel's history, but it still had an unexpected impact on Ethan. "You want to adopt him?" "It's a long and complicated process, but yes, I'm thinking about it." She looked directly at him. "That dream never died, Ethan. Just because we didn't work out doesn't mean I gave up on being a mother." Her words hit him hard. Of course, Rachel wouldn't give up. She had always been determined, always known what she wanted. The question was, what about him? What had he given up in the name of his convictions? Before he could respond, Rachel's phone rang. "I need to take this. It's from the courthouse." She stepped away a few paces. "Feel free to observe him a bit longer if you'd like." Alone in front of the glass, Ethan couldn't take his eyes off Michael. How could someone so small evoke such intense feelings? Why did he feel an inexplicable connection to that child? That same afternoon, after a planning meeting with his team, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to his mother's house in Hyde Park without warning. Helen Thompson, an elegant 70-year-old woman, was surprised to see her son at her door on an ordinary Wednesday. "Ethan, what a nice surprise. Did something happen?" "Not exactly, Mum. I just needed to talk." Helen led him to the back porch, her favorite spot in the house. The well-kept garden and the orchids she cultivated with devotion had always brought peace to Ethan since childhood. "I ran into Rachel yesterday," he said, after accepting a cup of coffee. "At the hospital where we're starting the expansion project." Helen watched him carefully. She had always been a perceptive woman. "And how did that go?" "Strange. She was holding a baby in her arms, one that had been abandoned at the hospital." He paused. "She's thinking of adopting him." Helen's expression softened. "That doesn't surprise me. Rachel always wanted to be a mother above all else, and I was the only obstacle to that." The confession came out more bitter than he intended. "You both wanted different things, son. No one is right or wrong in this story." Ethan took a sip of coffee, feeling the bitterness on his tongue. "Why was it so important for me to have a biological child, Mom? Why did I cling so tightly to this idea of my own flesh and blood?" Helen set her cup on the table, her gaze suddenly distant as if she were pondering something important. "Perhaps because your father always emphasized the importance of lineage, the continuity of the Thompson name." She took a deep breath. "But there's something you need to know, something I should have told you a long time ago." The seriousness in his mother's tone made Ethan sit up straight in his chair, suddenly alert. "What are you talking about?" Helen looked directly into her son's eyes, her hands slightly trembling as she held his. "Ethan, you were adopted when you were just a baby." "Adopted?" The word came out as a hoarse whisper from Ethan's mouth. "What do you mean, adopted?" Helen squeezed her son's hands tighter, as if fearing he might pull away both physically and emotionally. "Your father and I tried to have children for almost 10 years. We went through treatments, consultations with specialists, tried everything." Her eyes welled up. "Then we got news of a newborn who needed a home, a baby whose biological parents couldn't raise him. It was you, Ethan." The businessman felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. 42 years of life, and only now was he discovering that the story he had always believed to be his was nothing more than a construct. "And why did you never tell me? Why did you let me believe I was your biological son?" "It was your father who insisted. He was afraid you'd feel different, less of a Thompson." Helen wiped away a tear. "Robert came from a traditional family in the countryside of Minas, where lineage and the family name were everything. He loved you deeply, Ethan, but he carried those old values." "So, I've spent my whole life living a lie?" "Not a lie, son, just an incomplete truth." Helen picked up a photo album from the nearby shelf. "Look at these pictures. Do you think the love we felt for you was any less real because we didn't share the same blood?" Ethan flipped through the album in silence. Images of his childhood paraded before his eyes: his first birthday with a car-shaped cake, his father teaching him to ride a bike in the park, the three of them together on Miami Beach, his college graduation in engineering with his proud parents by his side. "You are my parents, you always have been." He closed the album, feeling exhausted. "But this revelation changes everything, Mom. Everything I thought about myself, about my choices, about Rachel. That's why I decided to tell you now. When you mentioned the baby and Rachel, I realized it might be time for you to know your true story." Ethan stood up, unable to stay seated. He walked through the garden. He had explored so many times as a child, trying to process the enormity of that revelation. Who were my biological parents? What happened to them? We know very little. They were young college students from Miami. They weren't in a position to raise a child at that time. It was a closed adoption, as was common back then. And they never tried to find me later. Not that we know of. The agreement was that it would be a permanent separation. Ethan stopped in front of an old mango tree at the back of the garden. He remembered how his father, Robert, the man he now knew didn't share his blood, had built a treehouse for him there, how they had spent entire afternoons up there, inventing stories about pirates and explorers. Did Dad know how much this whole blood and lineage thing mattered to me? How it affected my marriage? Helen approached, placing a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. He suspected, but he was too ill in his final years to address it. I think deep down, he blamed himself for instilling in you such a strong importance on bloodline and the continuation of the family name. Robert Thompson had battled cancer for nearly 5 years, passing away shortly before Ethan and Rachel's divorce. Now the words his father had repeated so often throughout his life, blood of our blood, continuation of the Thompson legacy, took on an almost ironic dimension. I need some time, Mum, to process all of this. I understand, son, but know that nothing changes how much you were and are loved. And maybe this revelation can help you see some things from a different perspective. The next morning, Ethan didn't go to the office. He asked Emily to reorganize his schedule and spent the day walking around the city. He wandered through Millennium Park from end to end, sat by the lake and watched families strolling with their children. Parents of all ages, children of all kinds, laughing, playing, living. Families formed through the most diverse paths. How many of those children running and having fun were adopted? How many of those parents, like his, had chosen to love a child who didn't come from their blood? And more importantly, did it make any real difference in the happiness they showed? When night fell, Ethan drove to the Chicago Medical Center. He didn't have any specific plans, just an inexplicable need to be there, as if the place held some answer he couldn't quite articulate. The building was quieter at that hour. Ethan walked through the halls, guided by a strange sense of familiarity. He reached the nursery almost without realizing it, and stopped in front of the glass, searching with his eyes for little Michael. You won't find him there. Rachel's voice surprised him. She was a few steps behind him, dressed casually, jeans and an olive green blouse he remembered seeing during their wedding. Where is he? With me. I got permission to take him home temporarily as part of the foster program. Ethan nodded, not quite sure what to say. There were a million thoughts in his head, but no words seemed adequate. What are you doing here at this hour, Ethan? Rachel asked, genuinely curious. I don't really know, he hesitated. I found out something yesterday, something that changed everything I ever believed about myself. Something in his expression must have revealed the gravity of the matter because Rachel stepped a little closer. Do you want to talk about it? My shift is over. Michael is with my sister in the cafeteria. Ethan didn't plan to tell Rachel about his discovery, not so soon at least. But there, standing before the woman with whom he had shared years of his life, he felt that perhaps this was the right place to start making sense of this new reality. They walked to the hospital cafeteria, which was nearly empty at that hour. In a corner table, Lauren, Rachel's sister, was gently rocking Michael while sipping coffee. Look who I found, Rachel said to her sister. Ethan, do you remember Lauren? Of course. How are you, Lauren? Good, thank you. She glanced from Rachel to Ethan, sensing some tension in the air. I think I'll take this little guy for a walk while you two talk. When they were alone at the table, a heavy silence settled. Rachel ordered coffee for both of them, and when the drinks arrived, Ethan finally found the courage to speak. I'm adopted, Rachel. I found out yesterday. The surprise on her face was genuine. Her eyes widened and she nearly dropped her cup. How did that happen? I mean, how did you find out? My mum told me. After I saw you with Michael, I went to talk to her. I ended up asking why it had been so important for me to have a biological child, and she decided it was time to tell me the truth. And how are you dealing with it? Honestly, I don't know. He stirred his cup without drinking the coffee. It's like my whole life was built on a story that wasn't completely true, as if I had been a different person from who I really am. You're the same person, Ethan. Your story just gained a new chapter, or rather, a prologue you didn't know about. There was a kindness in Rachel's voice that surprised him. After the difficult divorce, he had expected resentment, not understanding. The irony is that for years I refused to consider adoption. I insisted we needed to have a child who was of our own blood when I myself... He couldn't finish the sentence. When you yourself were living proof that family goes far beyond genetics, she completed softly. Exactly. And now, seeing you with Michael, I realize how blind I was. He looked directly into her eyes. I'm sorry, Rachel. I was wrong. The confession hung between them for a moment, heavy with the weight of lost years and possibilities that never came to be. There's no use thinking about what could have been, Ethan. We took different paths. I know. I'm not trying to reopen old wounds, he paused. I'm just trying to understand who I really am now that I know this part of my story. Lauren returned at that moment, with Michael awake and observing the surroundings with his big, curious eyes. I think someone got hungry, she commented, handing the baby to Rachel. Ethan watched as Rachel adjusted Michael in her arms with ease, as if she had been born for that role. The baby locked eyes with him for a moment, and Ethan felt something inexplicable, a connection he couldn't quite understand. Do you want to hold him? Rachel asked, noticing Ethan's gaze. Me? I don't know if... He hesitated, feeling strangely vulnerable. It's easy. You just need to support his head. Come on, try it. Before he could protest, Ethan found himself holding Michael in his arms. The baby weighed surprisingly little, and his curious eyes remained fixed on the businessman's face as if trying to figure out who this person was. Hello, Michael, Ethan whispered, feeling a lump in his throat. The baby responded with a movement of his hands, his tiny fingers opening and closing in the air. A gesture so simple, yet it seemed to pierce through all the defenses Ethan had built over the years. He likes you, Lauren commented, sitting back down. He's usually more reserved with strangers. Maybe he senses I'm not that much of a stranger, Ethan replied, not taking his eyes off the baby. Rachel watched the scene with an unreadable expression. Seeing her ex-husband, the man who had so resisted the idea of adoption, holding so carefully a baby who wasn't his own blood, stirred conflicting emotions within her. And you? How's the adoption process going? Ethan asked, as he carefully handed Michael back to Rachel. Complicated. There's another family interested with a very strong profile, and as a hospital employee, I have to be very careful not to seem like I'm using my position to gain an advantage in the process. I see. But do you really want to do this? Adopt on your own? The question could have sounded critical, but Ethan's tone was genuinely curious. It's not the ideal scenario, but yes, I'm ready to be a mother with or without a partner. She adjusted Michael in her lap. Some things can't wait forever. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of those words. How many opportunities had he missed by clinging to ideas he now realized were so fragile and arbitrary? Well, I have to go. Michael needs to rest, and I have an early hearing at the courthouse tomorrow. Rachel stood up. It was good talking to you, Ethan, and I'm sorry about the revelation regarding your adoption. I hope you find peace with this new part of your story. Thank you, Rachel, and good luck with Michael's adoption process. As he watched Rachel walk away with the baby in her arms, Ethan felt a strange mix of loss and clarity. It was as if he was simultaneously saying goodbye to one version of himself and welcoming another, one he was just beginning to know, but that might have always existed beneath the surface. In the weeks that followed, Ethan threw himself into the expansion project of the Chicago Medical Center. Work had always been his refuge, the way he dealt with complex emotional issues, and at that moment, there was nothing more complex than the discovery of his own origins. The construction site was beginning to take shape. Excavators, cranes, and dozens of workers tirelessly brought the ambitious architectural project to life, which would practically double the hospital's capacity. During his visits to oversee the progress, Ethan inevitably crossed paths with Rachel. Their encounters, once tense and uncomfortable, gradually became more friendly. How's Michael doing? He asked on one such occasion, as they walked side by side through the corridor connecting the main building to the construction area. Growing fast. He's almost 2 months old now, and looks like a completely different child compared to the fragile little baby who arrived here. Rachel smiled, and Ethan noticed how her eyes sparkled when she spoke of the boy. And the adoption process? Complicated. The other family is a couple, both doctors, financially stable, with a big house in Lakeview. They seem like the perfect candidates on paper, she sighed. But I'm still trying. I have a hearing scheduled for next week. Ethan nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of concern. Since he had held Michael in his arms that night at the coffee shop, something had shifted inside him. as if a switch that had always been off had been flipped. "If you need any help," he offered, leaving the sentence unfinished. Rachel looked at him, surprised. "Help? What kind of help could you possibly offer?" "I'm not sure. Maybe a letter of recommendation, a character reference, anything." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken questions. "Why would you do that, Ethan? After everything?" He didn't have a simple answer. How could he explain that discovering he was adopted had shattered a belief system that had guided his entire life? How could he put into words the feeling that maybe, in some way, he was making up for the mistake he had made years ago? "Because you deserve to be a mother, Rachel. You always have." The simplicity and sincerity of his response caught her off guard. She murmured a thank you and continued on her way, leaving Ethan with his thoughts. That same day, upon returning to the office, Ethan called his secretary. "Emily, I need you to do some research for me. I want to better understand how the adoption process works in the United States. Procedures, requirements, timelines." Emily looked at him intrigued, but as a seasoned professional, she simply nodded and noted the request without questioning his motives. 2 days later, Ethan had a comprehensive report on the adoption system on his desk. He read every page carefully, absorbing information about the National Adoption Registry, prospective parent qualifications, the trial period, and court rulings. The more he learned, the more he understood the challenges Rachel was facing. 1. Afternoon, while reviewing the structural plans for the new wing of the hospital, Ethan received an unexpected call. "Mr. Thompson?" "This is Fernanda Almeida, a social worker from the juvenile court. I'm calling because your name was mentioned in the adoption case of the child Michael Santos." "Michael?" "Yes, I'm familiar with the case." Ethan felt his heart race. "How can I help?" "We're conducting a thorough evaluation of the adoption candidates, and Dr. Rachel Oliveira recommended you as someone who could provide information about her. Would it be possible to schedule an interview?" "Of course, whenever. Works best for you." The interview was scheduled for the next morning at the courthouse itself. Ethan cancelled 3 important meetings to be there, something he would never do under normal circumstances. As he waited in the austere hallway of the courthouse, he watched families coming in and out of rooms, some with expressions of joy, others of apprehension. The weight of what was at stake, the future of a child, pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Mr. Thompson?" A middle-aged woman with graying hair tied in a bun approached. "I'm Fernanda Almeida. We can begin." The room was simple and functional. A table, a few chairs, shelves filled with files and case documents. Fernanda opened a file on her computer and began recording the interview. "For the record, could you explain your relationship with the adoption candidate, Rachel Oliveira? We're former spouses. We were married for 5 years. And how would you describe Rachel as a person?" Ethan took a deep breath. "Rachel is the most honest, dedicated, and loving person I've ever known. During our marriage, she showed an extraordinary ability to care for others, always putting their needs above her own." "Did the marriage end on amicable terms?" A delicate question. Not all breakups are entirely amicable. We had our differences, but there was never a lack of respect or hostility. "And what were those differences, if you don't mind sharing?" Ethan knew he had to be honest, even if it meant exposing his own flaws. "We wanted to have children. Rachel couldn't get pregnant, and when medical options ran out, she suggested adoption." He paused painfully. "I didn't accept the idea. I was fixated on having a biological child, someone who carried my blood, my genes. That impasse eventually led to our divorce." "And today? Do you still hold that position?" The question caught Ethan off guard, not because of its content, but because of the opportunity it offered to articulate the transformation he had undergone. "No. I recently found out I was adopted as a baby. My parents never told me, and I grew up believing in the importance of blood and lineage." He looked directly at Fernanda. "It was a revelation that completely changed my perspective. I realize now that family is about love, choice, and commitment, not biology. Fernanda nodded, taking notes. And how do you see Rachel as a potential adoptive mother? She would be the best mother any child could wish for. She has a natural instinct to care, to nurture. Seeing her with Michael, it's like she's found her true purpose. The social worker continued with a few more questions about Rachel's emotional and financial stability, to which Ethan answered with sincerity and conviction. At the end of the interview, Fernanda turned off the recorder and observed him carefully. "May I ask an unofficial question, Mr. Thompson?" "Of course." "Do you still have feelings for your ex-wife?" Ethan wasn't expecting that question. He remained silent for a few moments, reflecting not just on the answer but on the question itself. "I have deep respect and admiration for Rachel. As for the rest," he left the sentence hanging. "We're in different chapters of our lives now." Fernanda seemed satisfied with the answer. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Thompson. Your perspective will be very valuable to the process." As he left the courthouse, Ethan felt as though he had left behind a weight he had been carrying for years. He had been honest not just with the social worker, but with himself. And in that honesty, he had found a clarity that had previously eluded him. The next morning, without telling anyone, he did something completely out of character. He went to a notary's office in the city center and requested a copy of his full birth certificate. He wanted to see with his own eyes the document that proved his adoption, the story his parents had never told. When the document arrived in his hands, Ethan examined it carefully. There, in the remarks section, was the information about the adoption, the names of his biological parents, Anthony Smith and Marina Anderson, both college students, the date of the process, the responsible court. It was real. It was his story. Back at the office, he found Matthew waiting for him with a worried expression. "Where were you?" "We have a meeting with the investors in half an hour." "Sorry, I had to take care of something personal." Ethan tucked the certificate into his briefcase. "I'm ready now. Let's make this meeting happen." The expansion project for the Chicago Medical Center was progressing rapidly. The foundation phase was nearly complete, and the first structures were beginning to rise. During one of the site visits, Ethan ran into Rachel in the hallway, looking downcast. "Did something happen?" he asked, concerned. She hesitated before answering. "The hearing for Michael's adoption is scheduled for next week. The couple of doctors will also be there. They have everything in their favor. They're a traditional couple, financially stable. And you have everything in your favor too, Rachel. Don't give up." "I've already lost so many important things in life, Ethan. I don't know if I could handle losing Michael too." There was a vulnerability in her voice that touched Ethan deeply. Without thinking, he took her hands in his. "You won't lose him, I promise." Rachel looked at their joined hands, and then into Ethan's eyes, confused by the intensity of his promise. "How can you promise something like that?" "Because I know you. I know what you're capable of when you really want something. And because—" he hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "Because this time I'm by your side in this fight." The surprise on her face was evident. "But why? Why now, after everything?" "Because I finally understood what you've always known. That family is about choosing to love, not about biological impositions. And because—" he took a deep breath. "Because I want to be part of this story, somehow." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meanings, with unexplored possibilities. Before Rachel could respond, her phone rang. She let go of Tiago's hands, answering the call with a worried expression. "Yes, it's me. What? When? I'm on my way there right now." Hanging up the phone, she turned to Tiago, pale. "It's Michael. He had a high fever during the night and was just admitted to the neonatal ICU." The next 48 hours were the longest in Rachel's life. Michael had been admitted with an acute respiratory infection, which in such a small baby posed a significant risk. She didn't leave the neonatal ICU for a single minute, monitoring every procedure, every medication, every change in the boy's vital signs, the boy who, in such a short time, had become the center of her universe. To her surprise, Tiago stayed. by her side throughout the crisis. He rearranged his schedule, delegated responsibilities, and turned a corner of the waiting room into a makeshift office. From there, he continued managing the construction company and the hospital expansion project, while offering Rachel the support she so desperately needed at that moment. "You should go home and rest a little," he suggested, noticing the deep circles forming under her eyes. "I'll stay here and call you if there's any change." "I can't leave him, Tiago. What if he wakes up and doesn't see me? What if—" Rachel's voice faltered. "He'll be fine. Doctor Martinez said the antibiotics are working and the fever has already gone down." Tiago placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Michael is strong, Rachel, just like you." She nodded, fighting back tears. There was something about Tiago's presence that surprised her and at the same time comforted her. It was as if she was discovering a side of him that had always existed beneath the surface, but had never had the chance to emerge during their marriage. On the morning of the third day, the doctors finally brought good news. Michael was responding well to treatment, and if his progress remained positive, he could soon leave the ICU. "Did you hear that?" Rachel exclaimed, impulsively hugging Ethan. "He's going to be okay." The hug lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to awaken feelings they both thought had been left in the past. When they pulled away, there was a moment of awkwardness, quickly replaced by relieved smiles. "He's going to be okay," Ethan repeated, his voice heavy with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "And I think we're going to be okay too." That afternoon, while Michael slept peacefully, connected to fewer tubes and machines than in previous days, Rachel finally agreed to go to the cafeteria to eat something substantial. Ethan accompanied her, and for the first time in days, they had a moment to really talk without the urgency of the crisis. "Fernanda Almeida called me yesterday," Rachel commented, absent-mindedly stirring her soup. "She said you gave a very convincing statement." "About me?" Ethan smiled. "I just told the truth." "She also mentioned that you talked about your adoption." "Yes, it seemed relevant to the context." He paused. "Actually, I went to the records office and got my full birth certificate. Now I have the names of my biological parents if I ever want to look for them." "And do you?" "I don't know. Part of me is curious, of course. But Robert and Helen are my parents in every way that matters." He took a sip of coffee. "The funny thing is, for years I resisted the idea of adoption because I wanted a child of my own, when in reality I was living proof that that distinction makes no sense at all." "Sometimes we need a reality check to see the obvious," Rachel remarked with an understanding smile. They continued talking, reminiscing about moments from the past, but now with a new perspective, free from the bitterness that had once colored their memories. It was as if Michael's illness had created a neutral space, a truce where they could reconnect as people beyond the wounds of their failed relationship. In the days that followed, Michael improved quickly, much to everyone's relief. He was soon discharged from the ICU and moved to a regular room where Rachel could stay with him all the time. Ethan continued to show up daily, sometimes just for a few minutes, other times staying for hours, bringing food for Rachel, or simply keeping her company in silence. During one of these visits, he arrived with a different expression on his face, as if he had made an important decision. "I need to show you something," he said, handing Rachel a folder. Curious, she opened it and found several official-looking documents. As she read, her eyes widened. "Ethan, did you write a formal letter to the judge handling Michael's adoption case?" "I read that one of the factors considered is the support network the potential adoptive parent can offer. I thought my perspective as your ex-husband, as someone who knows you well, might carry some weight." He sat down in the chair beside her. "I also included an offer of financial support to ensure Michael has access to the best education and medical care possible." "You didn't have to do this," Rachel murmured, visibly moved. "I know, but I wanted to." He smiled. "Besides, I spoke with a few contacts in the judiciary, not to interfere with the process, but to make sure all relevant information is truly considered." "Why, Ethan? Why are you doing all this?" It was the question that had lingered between them for weeks. Ethan looked at Michael, who was sleeping peacefully in the hospital crib, and then at Rachel. "Because I finally understood what you've always known. That family isn't about blood or genes, it's about love, commitment, choice." He took her hand in his. "And maybe, if it's not too late, I'd like to try to be part of this family in some way." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibilities. Rachel didn't respond immediately, her eyes filling with tears that weren't of sadness. Before she could speak, they were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Fernanda Almeida, the social worker. "Sorry for the intrusion. I heard that little Michael was discharged from the ICU, and I came to see how he's doing." She glanced from Rachel to Ethan, noticing their intertwined hands. "Seems like I arrived at an important moment." Rachel discreetly wiped away her tears. "Come in, Fernanda. Michael is sleeping, but he's doing much better." The social worker approached the crib, observing the baby with a professional yet caring gaze. "He really does seem to be recovering well." Then, turning to Rachel, "Actually, I have another reason for being here." Judge Santos reviewed the entire case, including the new documents received. She glanced briefly at Ethan. "The final decision hearing has been moved up to tomorrow." "So soon?" Rachel felt her heart race. "I thought it would be next week." The judge believes that, considering Michael's health condition, the sooner his situation is resolved, the better it will be for him. Fernanda smiled slightly. "If I were you, I'd be at the courthouse tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp." After Fernanda left, Rachel turned to Ethan, her expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "Do you think I stand a chance against that perfect couple?" "I think the judge will see what I see, that there's no one more qualified to be Michael's mother than you." He squeezed her hand tighter. "And about what I said earlier, we can talk about that after the hearing," she replied softly. "One step at a time." The night was long for both of them. Rachel stayed at the hospital with Michael, while Ethan went home to try to rest with little success. The next morning, they met at the courthouse, both tense but determined. The courtroom was austere and formal. On one side, the couple of doctors, Dr. Paul Mendez and Dr. Ana Mendez, elegantly dressed and confident. On the other side, Rachel, with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, but with an unshakable determination in her gaze. Ethan sat right behind her, offering silent support. Judge Santos, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression, began the session. "We are here to decide on the adoption of the minor Michael Santos, currently under temporary state custody." He glanced at the documents in front of him. "We have 2 formal adoption requests under review, from Mr. Paul and Mrs. Ana Mendez, and from Mrs. Rachel Oliveira." The hearing proceeded with the lawyers from both sides presenting their arguments. The Mendez emphasized their stability as a couple, their comfortable financial situation, the spacious house with a backyard, and the availability of one of them always being at home, thanks to flexible hospital schedules. When it was Rachel's turn, her lawyer highlighted her commitment to Michael from day one, the emotional connection already established during the temporary foster care, her professional experience working with vulnerable children, and, surprisingly, the statements from Ethan and other documents he had arranged. The judge listened attentively, making occasional notes. When the lawyers concluded, he addressed Rachel directly. "Mrs. Oliveira, I understand that you are single and work full-time at the hospital. How do you plan to balance your professional responsibilities with raising a child?" Rachel stood up, taking a deep breath before responding. "Your Honor, I have worked at the Chicago Medical Center for 5 years. I have a strong support network, including my sister who lives 2 blocks away from me. Additionally," she hesitated for a second, "I recently received an offer to become the legal coordinator of the hospital's adoption program, which would allow for more flexible hours and even the possibility of working from home on some days." "I see. And what about the financial aspect?" "I have financial stability and enough savings to ensure that Michael will never lack anything. Moreover," she glanced briefly at Ethan, "I have the commitment of support from people who care about Michael's well-being as much as I do." The judge nodded, making a few more notes. He then addressed the Mendez with similar questions, which they answered with the same confidence and preparedness. In the end, he announced that he would retire to deliberate and return with a decision in 1 hour. Those 60 minutes felt like an eternity. Rachel and Ethan remained in the courthouse hallway, pacing back and forth, barely speaking, each immersed in their own thoughts and concerns. When the court officer finally announced that the judge had returned, they exchanged one last look of mutual encouragement before heading back into the courtroom. Judge Santos took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked around at everyone, present before speaking. Adoption cases are always complex, as we are deciding the future of a life. The minor Michael Santos deserves a family that will love him, protect him, and offer him every opportunity for his development. He paused. Both candidates have demonstrated excellent qualifications and a genuine desire to provide a loving home for this child. Rachel felt her heart nearly stop, bracing herself for the worst. However, after careful consideration of all factors, including the bond already established during the foster period and the exceptional commitment shown during the child's recent hospitalization, I have decided to grant permanent custody and authorize the adoption process to Ms. Rachel Oliveira. A collective sigh swept through the room. Rachel covered her face with her hands, unable to hold back tears of relief and happiness. The Mendez family, visibly disappointed but respectful, quietly congratulated her before leaving. Ethan approached her as soon as the judge adjourned the session, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You did it, Rachel. Michael is your son now." "I can't believe it," she murmured against his shoulder. "I'm finally going to be a mother. You always were. You were just waiting for the right child." As they left the courthouse, the sky over Chicago had never seemed so blue, despite the usual pollution. Rachel couldn't wait to go to the hospital and hold Michael, her son, officially and forever. "I need to go get him. Will you come with me?" she asked Ethan. "Of course." He smiled, taking her hand naturally, as if it were a gesture they had shared all their lives. "I think we have a lot to talk about on the way." During the drive to the hospital, Rachel and Ethan finally had the conversation they had been postponing. About the past they shared, the mistakes they made, the recent discoveries, and most importantly, about future possibilities. "I'm not asking for us to go back to what we were before," Ethan explained as he drove through the busy streets of Chicago. "We're different people now." "I certainly am, but I'd like to try to build something new, something that makes sense for who we are today." Rachel watched him for a moment, recognizing in the man beside her a more mature, more self-aware version of the one she had once loved. "Michael will always be my priority," she finally replied. "Anything that happens between us needs to take that into account. I wouldn't expect anything less. In fact, it's one of the things I admire most about you, that ability to love so completely." He paused at the red light, turning to face her. "I know I have a lot to prove, Rachel. I don't expect you to trust me right away. I'm just asking for a chance to show that I've changed, that I've finally understood what you've always known." "One step at a time," she agreed with a small smile, starting with formally introducing the godfather to the godson. "Godfather?" The surprise on Ethan's face was evident. "If you want to, of course. I thought it would be a good start." When they arrived at the hospital room where Michael was waiting, the nurse caring for him smiled when she saw Rachel. "Someone was eagerly waiting for Mommy," she commented, handing the baby into Rachel's arms. "Hi, my love. Mommy's back. And you know what? Now it's official and forever. You're my son." Rachel gently kissed Michael's forehead, and he watched her with his big, curious eyes, as if he understood the importance of that moment. Ethan watched the scene with barely contained emotion. How could he have been so blind? How had he not realized that family was exactly this overwhelming feeling of connection and belonging that had nothing to do with DNA or last names? "Do you want to hold him?" Rachel asked, noticing his gaze. With care, Ethan took Michael in his arms. The baby studied him for a moment before flashing a toothless grin, the first he had ever directed at the businessman. "Hello, Michael Oliveira. I'm Ethan, your godfather, and I promise I'll always be here for you and your mom no matter what happens." 3 months later, the new wing of the Chicago Medical Center was inaugurated. The project, completed ahead of schedule and within budget, was a source of pride for Ethan and his entire team. During the opening ceremony, he made sure to highlight the importance of the work done by the legal department and the adoption program, coordinated by Rachel. That same evening, while celebrating the success of the project with a small gathering at his apartment, Ethan watched Rachel on the terrace, with Michael asleep in her arms. The two had established a new routine over the past few months: occasional dinners, weekend park outings with Michael, honest conversations about expectations and fears. "What are you thinking about?" Rachel asked when he joined her on the terrace. "About how life takes unexpected turns." Ethan smiled, looking out at the illuminated city below them. "6 months ago, I was just a businessman obsessed with building an empire and securing my legacy through a blood heir. And now? Now I understand that legacy isn't about buildings or money or even carrying a name. It's about the lives we touch, the choices we make." He moved closer, wrapping an arm around her and watching Michael as he slept peacefully. "It's about building something even time can't destroy." Rachel rested her head on his shoulder, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. "We still have a long way to go," she murmured. "Yes, we do. And for the first time, I'm in no rush to reach the destination." Ethan gently kissed her forehead. "I'm learning to value the journey." In the carefully decorated nursery of Rachel's apartment, they placed Michael in his crib. The baby stirred slightly before falling back into a deep sleep, safe and loved. As they watched the little being who had transformed their lives in unimaginable ways, Ethan and Rachel understood that sometimes you have to lose something precious to finally find what truly matters. And that family, in the end, isn't something you inherit or determine by blood. It's something you build day by day, choice by choice, with love, commitment, and the courage to start over, even when the past seems to have closed all the doors. The tallest building Ethan would ever construct wouldn't be made of concrete and steel, but of moments, memories, and the kind of love that doesn't need documents or blood ties to be real and lasting. A legacy not of name or fortune, but of transformed hearts and redeemed lives, the true legacy of a family. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Ethan, Rachel, and little Michael has deeply touched your hearts. To follow more moving narratives like this one, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about families, new beginnings, and second chances. Find it right here by clicking to the left of the video. If this journey of discovery and transformation moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Daily, we bring new stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the surprises life has in store. What did you think of this ending? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're eager to read your reactions.